line. Now, this being the case, you'd be forgiven for thinking that maybe a 100 plus episode show entirely about boxing might not necessarily be up my alley. And it's here, my friends, that you'd be wrong. Hajime no Ippo is in a lot of ways the most exemplary and pure example of shonen anime within the entire genre. There's no superpowers, no laser blasts, no screaming so loud that your hair changes colour. Instead, what we have is a story about underdog boxer Makinochi Ippo and his journey to the top of Japan's boxing league. The manga is Shonen Jump's second most long-running series of all time, clocking in at a staggering 1,133 chapters and still ongoing to this day, and is written and illustrated by George Murakawa, who at an early age was infamous for brawling with other high school students, even somehow managing to get into a fist fight during his high school entrance exam. He'd eventually challenge this enthusiasm into boxing, and would later in life be the co-owner of the JB Sports Boxing Gym, as well as acting as a coach and second to many young boxers. And you only really need to read a few chapters of Hajime no Ippo to see just how deep his understanding of boxing really is. Every page of the manga is infused with a deep love and respect to the sport, and it's through this that we experience Ippo's journey. But in this modern era where chrome-headed superheroes defeat supervillains in a surprisingly minimal amount of punches, where a disproportionate number of kids named JoJo go on increasingly bizarre adventures, can a series conceived in the 80s simply about boys who like punching each other really hold up? Well, my friends, it's that time again, so let's put on our gloves, step into the ring, and talk about why you should watch Hajime no Ippo. Though it may not seem like it due to the relatively recent resurgence of sports-style anime that I like to dub beautiful boys doing things well, sports anime were actually a fairly tough pitch for Western audiences right up until relatively recently. Companies were notoriously hesitant to localize sports anime in the West, and the reason was right there in the name. Sports anime invariably focus upon sports, and that was enough to put off many cat-eared, pocky-eating Western fans, most likely due to preconceptions about sports and the people who enjoy them. But the thing is, a good sports anime is just that, it's a good anime. Series like Eyeshield 21, Haikyuu, and Slam Dunk are just as enjoyable and dramatic as other A-class shonen series, but getting past the initial "but I hate sports" barrier can be a tough sell for a lot of people. Yes, Hajime no Ippo is about boxing, but really that's just a framework for a beautifully nuanced and exceptionally well executed hero's journey to take place. And on that journey, you'll witness some of the most tremendously eruptive victories and losses this side of anime, as well as meeting some of the most likable and endearing characters within the genre as a whole. The first of which is our main protagonist, Makinochi Ippo. Ippo is the walking, punching embodiment of the traditional Japanese hero. He's quiet, he's polite, and he never challenges the status quo. Even when facing his opponent, he never has any kind of negative thing to say about them, nor does he ever try and present himself in a way that could be conceived as cool or aggressive. The most threatening he ever gets is giving his opponent this ever so slightly menacing glare, and even then I think I find the blue eagle from Muppets more intimidating. At first glance, he's not exactly ideal material for a story where major themes involve beating your opponent into unconsciousness. But where Ippo's character starts to become interesting is when you see just how genuinely good and decent a person he is. Ippo is not trying to be nice, he just is. He bows to the audience after winning fights, he works doubly hard to help out his mom with her fishing business, and rather than hate or begrudge his opponents, he nearly always tries to see the good in them, and often idealizes them even after defeating them. There doesn't seem to be a single hateful or negative bone in Ippo's entire body, and it's a lot of fun watching the innocent, good-spirited hero go up against a cavalcade of boxers who most certainly are not. The other big way the show gets us on Ippo's side is one of the oldest and most effective tricks in the book, and yet something that so many anime still get wrong: the slow progression of the hero's abilities over the course of the show. When we first join Ippo in episode 1, he's as far from a professional fighter as you can imagine. He's bullied at school, and his quiet nature means that he doesn't have any friends. Upon being saved by Takemura, and don't worry, we'll get to Takemura, he's brought to a boxing gym where we witness Ippo's first ever punch. Let's take a look. Good stuff, Ippo. What's important about this scene is it's letting us know that Ippo is starting from absolute zero. He doesn't possess any kind of innate talent apart from the above average upper body strength he naturally acquired from working on his mom's fishing boat. From here, we ever so slowly watch Ippo build up his repertoire of moves and techniques. He's so unskilled at the beginning that his first few wins really genuinely come across as flukes, but slowly we watch him expand outwards, mastering the jab, uppercut, blocking, footwork, head movement, dodging, countering, and eventually incorporating it all into his signature peekaboo style, and then eventually evolving that into his iconic Dempsey roll, one of the most stunningly devastating attacks in all of anime. Trust me, it will happen and you will lose your mind. Allowing Ippo to slowly develop his abilities like this not only makes every victory seem all the more rewarding, but also gives us a window into Ippo as a character. He's not really the brightest or most quick-witted, but he's passionate about what he loves and does his best to see the good in people. And it's this positive innocence that is beautifully contrasted against some of Ippo's opponents, many of whom are deeply dark and damaged people. A lot of shows nowadays, and particularly the ones based off light novels, seem to skip this part of the character's development. And when that happens, I always feel like we've missed a fundamental part of their growth as a character. Establishing a character's limitations and having them steadily rise past them can do wonders to save an otherwise average show. Take for example one of my guilty pleasures, 2006's Kenichi History's Strongest Disciple. It's not a fantastic show by any measure, but the one thing it absolutely nails is the progression of power. It's like 10 episodes before we even see the protagonist win a proper fight, and when we do, it's like, holy shit, did he just win? This kind of patience and investment gives a real, tangible feeling to your protagonist. It makes each victory actually matter and every defeat all the more devastating. In fact, one of my favourite arcs in all of Ippo is after Ippo suffers his first major loss. I was really surprised with how the show dealt with his disappointment over the fight, and we watched the young boxer sink into depression and really doubt himself for the first time. Shonen series always seem terrified of letting their heroes take a good, hard, genuine loss. It's like the industry is trying to create a generation of John Cena's. But in allowing our heroes to lose on occasion, we get to see a more vulnerable side of them, and in Ippo's case, it just makes us root for the little guy all the harder. Now don't get me wrong, he's still the hero and he still wins a lot, but the few losses he does take ground his character and inject real and tangible tension into both the story and the show's exquisitely brutal boxing matches. The boxing matches are of course the main attraction here. It's inside the ring that all the major moments of characters' lives happen. And you could, quite cynically mind you, boil the show down into just an ongoing series of boxing matches. Which might not sound like the most interesting or revolutionary plot structure, but what really matters is the way that Ippo executes on the idea. Each boxing match is in a sense its own narrative arc, taking anywhere from say 2 to 8 episodes to conclude. And these arcs are divided into two distinct sections, the build up to a match and the match itself. What you might be surprised about upon first viewing Hajime no Ippo is just how long we spend in the first of these two sections, the build-up, which takes place entirely outside the ring. It's here where we really get to know the characters. In fact, there's nearly a slice of life element to these sections as we watch the characters go about their daily lives, including training, jobs, and socializing. It can be a lot of fun, but it's also the time in the show where the stakes are really set. Let's take a look at one of my favourite build-ups from Season 3, Ippo versus the sinister and violent Sawarma. At first, Sawarma doesn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, but upon viewing the tapes of his previous fight, we see not only that he's an exceptionally skilled fighter, but also that he's a violent and brutal person. On top of that, Sawarma also announces that he has the perfect counter to Ippo's Dempsey roll, and at that point, the show has done all it really needs to establish a reasonable amount of tension for the fight. But where things get truly compelling is when we start to dig into Sawarma as a character, and we're painted the picture of a deeply damaged individual, one whose unfortunate upbringing has left him completely incapable of relating or empathizing with the people around him. Boxing is the only part of his life that makes sense, and even in that he regards himself an outsider. Only by defeating Ippo and proving that he's the best can Sawarma really find acceptance. The character is given further nuance by the presence of his old grade school teacher, who initially introduced Sawarma to boxing, but now fears that the sport has only nourished his natural desire to hurt people. And through this character, we really see what Sawarma is, someone who never really had a chance to become anything other than the violent monster he now is, and we both despise and pity him for it. And thus, a tense dynamic is formed within the audience. Making things even more compelling again is the contrast between Sawarma and Ippo. At this point of the show, the audience is well familiar with Ippo's good nature and gentle heart, and watching him go up against the deeply broken Sawarma creates an atmosphere that cuts like a razor. Which brings us to what is essentially the centerpiece of the entire show and its universe, the boxing matches themselves. I think one thing that's interesting to note here is that while a lot of Hajime no Ippo's build-up sections involve a lot of dialogue between characters, there's very little in the way of animation or visual design. But within the matches themselves, the show switches gears and begins telling its story largely through the visuals as opposed to dialogue, and to some absolutely stunning effects. The weighty, brutal and visceral fights of the manga have been translated perfectly. Each movement of the boxers is communicated with real weight and purpose. Each potential attack carries with it a tangible feeling of force, and when one lands, there's a real lasting sense of physical consequence to it. One of the biggest ways the show does this is by slowing down time to a crawl and letting the tension build to a peak. And just when things become unbearable, the action explodes in a visceral burst of force. Not only does this infinitely help out with the pacing and timing of each fight, but Madhouse has used these sections of slowed time to focus on all these subtle little angles of the boxer's body in motion. It really emphasizes just how much force is behind each attack, and it's an attention to detail like this that lets the punches of Hajime no Ippo pack a harder punch than the superpowered laser blasts of shows like Dragon Ball Z. The show also uses these moments of slowed time to convey to us exactly what a boxer is thinking at that moment, and watching them try to figure out each other's next move and act accordingly adds a crucial layer of strategy and mind games to the matches, as even very minute shifts in weight and timing can lead to a dramatic and often explosive change in the direction of the match. The show also makes good use of these little visual motifs that really drive home the physical storytelling. For instance, I love the use of these dense bursts of white mist that are used to convey momentum, velocity, and impact. Much to my delight, the matches will often dive into ludicrous visual metaphor territory, such as suggesting Swarma's fist is actually a pistol, or that fighting Borg is like fighting a pair of wolves. Obviously, this is more than a little ridiculous, but it makes for a fun watch and does help convey the situational storytelling of each fight, as well as doing a lot to explain the unique narrative to each and every match. Backing up the unique visuals is some absolutely stellar sound design. Sound design is something I don't see called out a whole lot in anime review circles, but it's something that, when handled right, can add an incredible amount to a scene. All the most dramatic moments of Ippo are elevated with some really creative and impactful audio. Punches explode with the sound of jet engines, and boxers shift their weight to the sound of screeching tires, and it's all scored with some of the most beautifully dramatic music in the industry. Like, seriously, listen to this shit.
まだまずそうだなかいくぐったいけいかん完全にタイミングをものにされとるカウンター一戦チャンピオンの体を先行は貫く
Furthermore, the show also knows exactly how to use near silence to build tension to an unbearable level, only then to let the action resume with an intense cacophony of dramatic noise. This is bold and confident sound design, and something I'd really like to see more of in other shows. The major other thing that you need to know about the fights of Hajime no Ippo, and I cannot stress this enough, it is how each fight is essentially its own narrative. We have two characters, both of whom are going to be in very different places in their lives by the time the last bell rings, and it's the journey there that the real heart of the series lies. The narrative variety between each individual boxing match is exceptional. No two fights ever feel the same, and each new opponent is a puzzle for Ippo to solve. Some fights, particularly those featuring Aoki, can be hilarious displays of physical comedy, while others, like Ippo's title fight against Sendo, can be near existential battles against the seemingly impossible. Each fight has a constantly shifting momentum, and every time a new hit lands in that moment, it shifts and recontextualizes that fighter's chance of winning. What can seem like a sure victory one moment can quickly turn into a disastrous battle to stay conscious, such as Ippo's fight from Season 1, where a far less talented boxer fights dirty in order to drain Ippo's stamina, causing what should be an easy fight to become a desperate struggle against the odds. Once a fight concludes, we go straight into the build-up for the next fight, and this is essentially how the show works. You have your setup through slice of life / training sections, as well as your payoff in the matches themselves. This might sound formulaic, but trust me, that doesn't need to be a bad thing, especially when it's executed as well as this. Not only that, it's a formula that the show is constantly tinkering with and even subverting. And in fact, one of the major ways it does this is it takes the focus away from Ippo entirely, and focuses instead on members of what, in my opinion, is one of the strongest supporting cast of any large shonen series. Some of these will be from Ippo's constant cycle of unique and interesting opponents, many of whom have their own fully fleshed out backstory and own reasons for fighting, such as the aggressive and overly confident Sendo, who actually feels like he could be the main character of an entirely different boxing anime, but it just so happens that he exists in Ippo's world. His fanbase are rabid in a way that Ippo's simply are not, and the subplot about him buying kids a Sega Mega Drive is endearing as hell. The show also isn't afraid to switch track and make Ippo's opponents the underdog, such as the sympathetic Now from Season 2, who, if he can't defeat Ippo, may have to face retirement. The show does a good job of changing up the formula and keeping Ippo's opponents interesting, but where the supporting cast really shine is in Ippo's lovable hooligan punk gym mates. While they start off as merely background characters, each one slowly starts to develop their own narrative arc, and before long, each one is getting their own multi-episode matches, and it's here that the show is really able to have fun with our expectations. All Ippo's gym mates are in a different weight class to him, so they never really cross the barrier into being actual rivals. Nothing Ippo does directly affects their own personal journey, nor do anything they do really affect Ippo's. And I really think this helps define them as their own characters on their own journey. Aoki and Kimura, for example, have been boxing for far longer than Ippo, but on top of dealing with the fact that they both may be in the twilight of their boxing career, they also must deal with that they both take far more losses than Ippo or Takamura. This brings an entirely different dynamic to their story arcs. Their matches aren't so much rooted in power fantasy, but more just the journey of these characters. When either one does achieve victory, there's an actual feeling of surprise. We know on an intellectual level that Ippo is probably going to win most of his fights, purely by virtue that his name is in the title. But with Aoki and Kimura, we have no such guarantee, and the threat of defeat is always real and looming. Watching these two struggle creates an entirely different dynamic to Ippo's story, and gives a pacing and texture to the show as a whole, and their backstory as Yankee hooligans is one of the most hilarious and enjoyable arcs of the entire show. Head trainer of the KBG boxing gym is the iron-fisted liege coach Kamigawa. Watching him mercilessly beat the boxers into shape is constantly entertaining. A great degree of comedy is derived from his exchanges with Takamura, but the way the two care for and respect each other is really heartwarming. If they're talked down by the riverside before Takamura's title fight doesn't have you well up even a little, then you, my friend, are a unfeeling monster who needs to be ostracized from society as quickly as humanly possible. The coach is also the focus of one of my favourite and most unique arcs of the entire show, which is a flashback to post-World War II America occupied Japan. In a mere 3 episodes, it tells the stunning story of how the coach became a boxer, a complicated love triangle, and culminates in easily one of the greatest and most stunningly clinch matches of the entire show, where there are no weight classes and Kamigawa faces off against a massive American-born general. This brings us to my absolute favourite character of the entire show, Takamura. Story arcs that focuses upon him are rare. We usually only get maybe 1 or 2 a season, but when we do, holy hell do they burn the house down. As a character, Takamura is as far from Ippo as you can get. He's loud, vulgar, offensive, and insanely overconfident, and still you can't help but love the guy. He takes on all life's challenges and head on, and refuses to view the world in any way but his own. On top of that, he's so naturally gifted that many of his matches are played for laughs as he dismantles Japan's heavyweight division with a comedic bravado. But it's later on, when he steps onto the world stage, that his story really begins. For the first time, Takamura faces opponents that are on his level, and it's here where we get to see the character really shine. Unlike Ippo, the show doesn't portray Takamura as an underdog, but as a superhero, one that you really want to believe could never lose. But it's this fear that gives his fights an edge and tension simply unmatched by any other, and no better example of this than the exceptional setup and payoff of his monumental world title battle with the monstrous champion Brian Hawk. There's also some really great comedy to be found in the interactions with Ippo and his gym mates. Ippo is a nice and pure boy, but his gym mates sure as hell are not, and it's hilarious watching them do everything they can to mess with the guy. I think in the hands of a weaker writer, these scenes could have quickly grown tiresome, but a lot of this stuff had me grinning like an idiot, helped in no small part by the real and genuine friendship that grows between Ippo and the others over the course of the show. Yes, they torment each other, but there's a real bond here, and by the end of it all, this group of idiots had enamored themselves to me in a way that few other supporting casts do. All that said, we're at that point where I feel it only fair to talk about what I consider some of the show's shortcomings. Ippo's main rival Mayata, while being a decent character in his own right, pales in comparison to many of Ippo's other rivals, and considering he's essentially the Vegeta of the show, that's more than a little disappointing. The pacing of the show can be at times grueling, especially in the lead up to a big fight. There's even one instance where the character leaves the locker room to head out at the start of the episode, and by the end of the episode he still has not reached the ring to begin a fight. Now that said, I never felt like the show was wasting my time, and a degree of that is just how well the show builds tension, but yes, it can be a little frustrating. My regular criticism of shonen anime applies here too. There's very few female characters, and what are there are usually either mother figures or love interests. But I suppose, considering that this is a series set in a men's boxing league in the 80s Japan, perhaps that point is a little mute. But still, given how prominent women's martial arts has become in recent times, it would be an interesting avenue to explore. And if you want to check out a sports manga that actually does this, then I highly recommend the exceptional Teppu, written by Muar Oota. It tells the story of high school student Natsuo Ishido and her journey into women's MMA. The art's gorgeous, the fights are stunning, and the hate-filled and mean-spirited Natsuo is a startlingly different kind of protagonist than you might be used to. I'll probably talk about this manga more in a future video, but for now just know that it's probably one of my favourites within the last 10 years. So all that said, there's still one other aspect of the show we need to cover. For anyone who's been keeping track of my Why You Should Watches, you'll know I put a lot of stock into shows that push the medium forward. Shows that say something new and different and can potentially recontextualize how we both view shows of that type, as well as narrative storytelling in general. And so the question becomes, how does Ippo do this? How does Ippo evolve the shonen genre? And the answer is quite simple. It doesn't. Even at the time of its conception, boxing series like Ashitaka no Joe had already taken Japan by storm, and even as an ardent fan of Ippo, I'd have no trouble saying that there are very few truly original things about it. But in judging it by this standard, you can easily miss the best thing about it. Hajime no Ippo is not an advancement of the shonen genre, it is a celebration of it. It's a show that intricately understands the core fundamentals of the shonen genre, and through mastery of these fundamentals, exemplifies the very best of what shonen can be. All the struggle, friendship, soaring victories, and crushing defeats, it's all here, and it's all handled with a love and care that can only come from someone with a deep and endearing love of the genre, as well as the sport upon which Ippo is based. No, I don't love boxing, but after experiencing Ippo, I understand exactly why Murakawa does. But more so than even that, this is a show about slowly surpassing one's limits and reaching for that next major milestone. And it's this honest and open communication that is the driving force behind a show that encapsulates the very best of what shonen has to offer. And this, my dear viewers, is why you should watch Hajime no Ippo. Friends, that's going to do it for today. I just wanted to mention that I recently passed 1,000 subscribers, and while I know in the grand scheme of things that is a relatively small number, it really does mean a whole lot to me. So genuinely guys, thank you so much to everyone who has liked, commented and subscribed. And in the meantime guys, take care of yourselves and I'll see you next time.
Three stones with one bird. Behave, forget band. Three stones with one bird. Three stones with one bird. Three stones with one bird. Hand over your pancreas. Three stones with one bird. Three stones with one bird. Behave, forget band. Three stones with one bird. Behave, forget band. Hand over your pancreas. Three stones with one bird. Hand over your pancreas. Hand over your pancreas.
Who's that? Whew, okay. Jumbo Jazz, bro. Oh. Excuse me? You can see him. Give him a kiss. That's what I'm fucking talking about. That's why I'm the GOAT. That's why I'm the fucking GOAT. Oh my god, dude. God run, finally. God run. Oh, God run.